Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and today's review is going to be of the Aurorus Borealis, a name to be taken lightly. Okay, this is a full-size, open-back dynamic driver headphone that has an MSRP of $899 US. Aurorus Audio reached out to me about 6 or so weeks ago and asked if I would be interested in reviewing this and their Australis headphone, and I was like, yeah, I'll do that. And they were very explicit up front that I had free reign to be as positive or as negative as I felt was appropriate in reviewing their products. So they have made no attempt to influence my opinion one way or the other. My correspondence with them has been quite enjoyable. They have been very responsive in answering a lot of my tech questions and all of that about their products and all that. These are a loan from Aurorus. They will be going back when I am done with the review. So let's go ahead and do shameless self-promotion, and then we will do our review of the Aurorus Borealis.
Hi, I'm Wave Theory's human companion, and he wants you to know that your support of this YouTube channel helps keep the reviews coming. If you enjoy Wave Theory's honest, thorough style, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the links in the description below to sign up for the Patreon or send him a tip through PayPal. All right, enjoy the musings.
So as I said in the intro, this is a $900 US open back dynamic driver headphone, which has a very interesting aesthetic to it, which I am going to give you a closer look at here in an overhead view in mere moments. Some quick specs on this is that we have a 50mm dynamic driver in each cup. They are 32 ohm impedance drivers. No sensitivity information was given on the web page. However, I did find them to be fairly high in sensitivity. These are not a particularly difficult load on an amplifier, and you can drive them fairly well with mobile amps like dongle DACs and things like that. So they are not super power hungry. If I had to guess, and this is just an educated guess, the sensitivity of the drivers is probably in the upper 90s of dB per milliwatt range in there, just given how they respond to lower powered amps and that sort of thing. All right, we'll go ahead and do a quick overhead view of the build here, and I'll show you one of the cables in there as well. There is, at least as of the filming of this video, and I sit down to film this on July 21st of 2023, the website has these listed as out of stock, and I've just before I sat down to film this video, I shot them an email, Aurorus an email, and asked them, like, when do they plan to have these back in stock? And when I get an answer to that, I will pin the answer in a comment down below, so check that out. Okay. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that overhead view and take a quick tour of the headphone, talk about the cable and all of those sorts of things, and we'll come back on the other side and get into the test gear and the sound and all of that fun stuff. Here we go. All right, let's look at the build of the Bore here. And I think this viewpoint is, again, a little bit better because I want to show you the back of the cups here. So this is a very interesting aesthetic, I think, and what makes it interesting is that it almost looks unfinished here on the back of the cup, right? Like there's like no grill material or anything here over the back of the driver as we are used to seeing in an open back headphone. So it looks kind of like a more of like a prototype kind of thing, like it's a proof of concept kind of a thing rather than a finished product, at least from an aesthetic standpoint, until you look a little bit deeper, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. But a really quick look here, we have like a really durable kind of plastic material here that that the headphone like chassis is made of here. I don't know if it's 3D printed, doesn't have the markings of a 3D printer, but anyway, it's like pretty solidly built there. And then, I mean, you see the wires, but they have insulating material over them and all of that. And then we have like this fabric-y kind of material down here. And I'll show you the other side of that here in a moment. But basically, I mean, it's open back. I mean, it's about as open back as a thing gets because there literally is no back here. So this is the back of the magnet structure of the driver right there. And then you see the paper material over the back parts of the driver. So you may think it needs a little bit more protection in there, but honestly, like, you've got to be pretty intentional about getting fingers down in there to do anything. And then even then, you're not actually touching the membrane. That's like the protective paper layer that comes over the back of a lot of dynamic drivers in there. All right, dual 4-pin XLR cable entry here that is angled forward quite a ways. The cabling is compatible with any cables that come with Audeze, ZMF, or the Mezes that use the Mini XLR. So lots of options for aftermarket cables if you want them. I will show you the stock cable, or one of the flavors of stock cable, here in a moment. Here is one of the stock cable, I believe, are options. I asked a clarifying question about that, but anyway, just all of the cables they sent me look like this, basically. So we have the two 4-pin XLR on the headphone end, and then we have this nice flat ribbon style cable here. And I mean, you see it lays well on the desk. It actually does not tangle up well. This is one of the better stock cables. This particular one is terminated in 3.5 millimeter single-ended TRS on the amp end, but they sent me 3 other types. They gave me a 1/4-inch single-ended here, or 6.35 millimeter, okay, 4.4 millimeter Pentacon, and then 4-pin XLR. So you can have this terminated on the amp end in different ways. Okay, on there, and they sent me all of them to try, and they all look like this, which is just why I'm just showing you one of them. But honestly, I didn't have any sonic issues with this cable. Like the Meze 109 Pro that I just reviewed, the stock cable actively harmed the sound signature of that headphone. Some of the cheaper HiFiMans have the same problem. Focals are notorious for the cables that they have. They actively harm the sound, and these don't do that. And again, they're pretty soft, supple, lay on the desk well. So this is one of the better stock cabling experiences I have had with a headphone of any price, really. So well done on that. We have like this Dan Clark style headband system here, where we just have these like tension bars, or whatever you call these things, up here. And then we have the suspension strap, which is a Velcro pad over top of, like, it really looks like they probably just cut the seatbelts out of a bunch of cars here for that strap right there. But I mean, it works reasonably well. I do personally wish that it would clamp just a little bit harder, because these can slide around on my head a little bit, but there's plenty of range of motion in here. And then, you know, we have some motion this way too, and that's tensioned well. Like, that's not a sloppy movement there at all. Like, there's some nice resistance into that motion there. All right, let me just, angled pads. We have perforated leather on the outside, or at least a faux leather. I think I saw on their website no animal products, but that might be someone else. Forgiveness either way if I'm wrong on that. Then we have like this velour part here that touches the head, and we see that the ear opening is not very big. I didn't have an issue with this. This is not a very deep opening. These are nice and soft, but I can see how some people, this will rest on the ear a little bit too much, or it won't be deep enough for their ears. So that might be something for some listeners to keep in mind. There is a slight, I think you can see it better here, there is a slight forward angle to the pads too. So they are thicker in the back than in the front. Okay, but yeah, that is one thing to keep in mind for someone who has large ears or ears that stick out, is that these are going to sit on the ears for a lot of people, or at least on portions of the ears. But again, they do not clamp very hard, and I didn't have any problems with like pressure on the side of my head or anything like that. And I mean, I wear glasses, as you can tell, when I'm on camera, and that was not an issue for me anyway. Okay, So let's come back to this. It kind of looks like it's unfinished here, but the way that this cup is constructed is actually pretty smart, because if we look at the other side, these pads do just come right off, okay, with that kind of overlap right there, pretty common style. And we see the driver in there, and just the way that it's made here, here's the other side of that fabric-y material. So there's a lot of room to breathe right here through the back of the cup. But like you see, all of the valuable parts of the driver in there are fairly well protected on this. So you would basically have to take like a screwdriver or something and punch it down in there to damage the driver, I think. So even though it looks unfinished, they were very smart and strategic about where all of this structural stuff and all of that went, and it does protect the driver pretty well. All right, back to me on camera talking about other things. All right, actually, before we jump into test gear and the sound, I did mention in there that I'm going to talk about the comfort and the fit. So we see the build here, and the one thing I may not have shown you is that the head size adjustment is right here. These pieces here slide up and down, and they're fairly well tensioned. Like you can see that I've got to put a fair amount of force on them to get them to move, but you can accommodate pretty large heads by the time you get up to that range there. So that's the head size adjustment. For me, I tended to have them not quite all the way down, but just like a millimeter or two gap kind of thing in there is where it was comfortable for me. So when they sit on the head, I mentioned that this motion this way is well tensioned. If I just put them on, I feel like there's a little bit of a gap between the pad and my head here on the bottom. So I usually have to just push the bottom of the cups in just a little bit to feel like I am getting a full pad seal, at least, around my head there. And I realize that there's that fabric in there, so there's a lot of venting going on anyway, but it still benefits from a general pad seal, I think. So I just have to push them in a little bit. Now, the clamp is not particularly strong, and these are not super heavy headphones. They're not like Odyssey LCD series bulky and heavy that way, but they're also not super light like the Sennheiser HD600 series kind of light or anything like that. They're kind of in the middle there. The weight is distributed well with the suspension strap and all of that, but I wish the clamp was just a little bit harder, because they do, as I move my head around, they do slide around just a little bit. And as I've mentioned before on this channel, like my day job is as a college professor, and so as I'm sitting at my desk, I'll be doing some grading or something like that, and I'll be trying to grade quizzes, and I look down to see the papers in front of me, and if I'm wearing a headphone like this, I feel it slide forward as I look down. So if you're planning to get these to do work in, and that work requires you to move your head a lot, just keep in mind that that's going to be a little bit of an issue. Now, the bigger your head gets physically, the less of a problem that probably is, because I think it will feel a little bit tighter the more it stretches out this way. Okay, so with that, let's turn our attention to the sound and that sort of thing. And actually, real quick, let me show you. They do come in this nice box right here. You get this nice, solid, pretty durable carrying case that is big and bulky, so they are not transport friendly, but you do get this nice box that they come in. Okay, now test gear. I tried these on a variety of signal chains. Like I just mentioned, I tried some mobile gear like the HiFiMan S9 Pro little dongle DAC. Drives this fine. You lose some volume control just because of the way the HiFiMan is made, but in terms of power, does fine. KN N6 Mark II DAP with EO2 module drives this just fine. My Cord Hugo 2 then, of course, drives this just fine. Desktop systems that I used what I would consider like a real-world signal chain in terms of price that might be driving a $900 headphone, and that would be the Gishelli J2S DAC, which I am working on a review for. It is coming along. I will get that out as soon as I can. But anyway, with the Sparkos op amps in the J2S, that if you do it, depending on how you want to do it, it's around a $500 to $600 DAC with that. And then Lake People G111 Mark II headphone amp, which is around $550 US, $600 US, in that range these days for the amp. So that's kind of like, you know, in a price range for a signal chain, I think that that would be found in the wild commonly on a $900 US headphone. I did check the scaling up abilities by listening to it a little bit on a chain that is currently a Gustard R26 and a head amp GSX Mini, and then also my big guns, the Berkeley Alpha Series 2 DAC and my Vioelectric HP V281 amplifier. All of those desktop signal chains would have been sourced from a Sonor Ultra Rendu streamer using it as a Roon endpoint and using either local lossless or high-res FLAC and DSD files, or streaming lossless FLAC or high-res FLAC files from Qobuz. All right, and then the Ultra Rendu would have been fed to the various DACs using a Singer SU6 DDC in between. Okay. So then let's talk about sound, and I gotta say that overall these are a quite impressive sonic package. I would say strengths of the sound here generally, before we get into the ins and outs of the signature, the strengths here are you get a pretty expansive soundstage. There is a pretty good resolution for the price point. In fact, this is one of the more resolving, but not aggressively so, natural sounding in its detail retrieval, I think. But anyway, one of the more resolving headphones under $1,000. And the dynamics. It's got a lively and fun, but not distractingly forward energy to it, dynamics and that sort of thing. So those are the big strengths. Now, the tonality is not necessarily a weakness. It's pretty well tonally balanced through most of the frequency range, but there is a little bit of forwardness around about 1.5 kilohertz that does have a deleterious effect on the timbre. It's not terrible, but we'll unpack that here a little bit in a moment there with that. So, from a frequency response standpoint, I just let the cat out of the bag a little bit there. Like, the signature is mostly neutral. The ear is going to be drawn to the low bass a little bit because the bass performance on this is pretty impressive. There is good bass extension, there's a lot of activity and dynamic punch and impact to the bass, and there's a fair amount of bass presence, although I don't really get the sense that the bass is elevated. It just comes across as a little bit more noticeable and forward because of just how detailed and energetic and fun the bass presentation is. But it is well textured, it's got good pitch definition and all of that going on in the low end. Like, this is one of the better bass presentations I have heard for a headphone anywhere around its price. Again, without really pushing the level forward or bringing in a bass shelf in there. I also like the treble tonality and timbre. Cymbals sound pretty even and natural sounding and all of that. Now, the weakness, I think, from a tonality standpoint is that slight forwardness around 1.5 kilohertz. Vocals can stand out a little bit more. They are slightly hollow sounding in their timbre. It is not terrible, though. Like, I am a person who is very sensitive to things like shoutiness and honkiness and that sort of thing in the mid-range range. And these very rarely ever sounded shouty or honky to me. So the forwardness is there. It is detectable. It is not overly problematic most of the time. But if you are a vocal timbre hawk, as I can be sometimes, it is not quite natural, at least to my ear, just a little bit of nasaliness kind of thing going on because of that forwardness. But that also can help some instruments, like snare drums have a nice, tight, quick snap to them and all of that, which that slight forwardness through that range can help with that if that's something that you like and are interested in. Now, There is that expansive soundstage here, which I'll talk about more in a moment, but that forwardness around 1.5 kilohertz does make the vocal presentation and some mid-range instruments, like if you listen to string quartets and that sort of thing, makes them sound a little bit more intimate. So there's this closeness in that range, and this, like, that range stands out a little bit and feels a little bit more closer and intimate. Okay, despite the fact that the overall presentation and size is quite expansive. So some people like that, some people don't. I'm just saying that that's the way this headphone presents music, at least to my ear, because of that slight range there. So let's leave that one be for now, and let's come back and let's talk about that expansive soundstage. Very wide and some of the best depth that I've heard in an under $1,000 headphone. So there's nice depth and layering to the sound this way. So it's not wall of sound or anything like that. It does one of the better jobs, again, for a headphone under $1,000 that I have heard with the depth dimension. Very wide soundstage, good imaging and separation, and it's got very good spatial and instrument and vocal separation out and everything, so everything sounds appropriately in its place. It's not as three-dimensional or holographic as more expensive or big planar models that are out there. Like, no, it's not going to catch some of the more expensive dynamic drivers headphones that I've heard out there that can do that. Like, it's not going to stage or separate or anything quite like an Ascend HD800S. It's not going to catch like the HiFiMan HE6sev2 series or anything like that in terms of how three-dimensional and holographic it is. But at its price point, it is definitely in like the lead pack, I think, in terms of those abilities. All right, every once in a while there was a tiny bit of sibilance, I should say, too, but not really ever much of a problem there. And then again, overall, the dynamics and all that, it's an active and lively sound without sounding overly forward or aggressive. The resolution, also very good. There's a lot of texturing for the sound at this price and all of that, but it's a very natural presentation to the detail retrieval. Like, it just sounds like the details are neither forward nor drawn back. They are just kind of what they need to be, and at least to my ear, sound pretty natural. Okay, so I enjoy listening to this headphone, if you can't tell. I think it does a lot of important things for the sound really well. And the big drawback to me sonically being that slight 1.5K forwardness is not so bad that it wrecks my ability to enjoy this headphone more often than not. There are some times I found it distracting, but for the majority of the material that I listened to and for the time that I listened to it, it was fine. Okay, so pretty good job there on its own. Let's talk about where it fits into the market. I have on loan here from a friend a Focal Elex, which is also an open back dynamic driver headphone, $750 right now. I think the Borealis is a clear step up from this one in terms of resolution and the accuracy of the imaging and the separation and all that, like the positional accuracy of the sound field. And the Borealis also stages much bigger. It's a much more expansive sound stage than what this one does. This one rolls off the upper treble just a little bit in comparison to the Borealis, so if you're treble sensitive, this one might be a little bit less fatiguing as a result of that. But I think the Focal here still has a slight advantage, although not a big one, but a slight advantage in terms of the dynamic impact on it, because that is just a Focal trait. They are one of the elite brands in terms of being able to hit you, right, with their presentation. Okay. The most recent review I did was of the Meze 109 Pro, which is still up here, hasn't gone back yet, though it will soon. And that one has a comfort advantage to me. Like, it feels a little bit better on my head. It doesn't slosh around or slide around on my head and all that, so I like its comfort a little bit better. The aesthetic of it and the build, I think, it at least looks better than the Borealis. I don't know that it necessarily is actually built better, but it looks better to my eye anyway. I almost said to my ear on that one. That wouldn't have made sense. But to my eye, it looks a little bit better. And sonically, I think the one advantage that the Meze 109 Pro has over the Borealis, because in terms of their staging size and all of that, they are quite similar. But the one true advantage the 109 Pro has is it's a little bit more tonally balanced through the mid-range. So specifically vocals and string instruments and all of that sound a little bit more natural in their timbre to me from the $800 109 Pro than they do from the Bore here. But outside of that, I preferred the Bore on pretty much every other technical aspect. It was just a more complete and enjoyable headphone to me outside of that one mid-range range there. Okay, got a couple HiFiMans around here to compare. The HE6se V2, and I realize that this is a planar magnetic headphone, and so some people don't like comparing dynamics to planars, but I bring it out here just to say, you know, like, where does this fit in the market? This one, for a long time, was available from Adorama, you know, somewhere in like the $400 to $700 price range, which was just a ridiculous markdown. But I will say that this was, once upon a time, like at least the HE6 was what, an $1,800 unit once upon a time? And I think in terms of resolution and the accuracy of the imaging and the separation and all of that, in terms of like how holographic it can get, the Bore is right there with the HE6se V2, and it does it in a much, much easier to drive package, because again, this one is notoriously difficult to drive, requires a lot of amplifier power. In terms of dynamics, I still give a slight edge to the HE6se V2. I think it slams just a little bit harder, particularly in the low end, but this one is really not far behind. This one has just a little bit better bass extension than this one. I think that's a difference between planar and dynamic, although it's not a huge difference either. But this one, like the Bore stage is bigger. Has a little bit bigger sound stage in this one. This one is just a little bit smaller and a little bit more intimate. Not small in a universal sense, but just not as big as the Borealis. But to say that the Borealis is catching the HE6se V2 here, given the price that it was not all that long ago, catches it in terms of resolution, is right there with it in terms of like timbre and overall tonality, I think. Maybe the mids on here are a little bit cleaner, but this one gets a little bit more sibilant than the Bore does, I should say. But anyway, the fact that the Bore is right there with this one in some important technicalities, I think speaks volumes to the performance of the Bore. And so just keep that in mind if you are in the market for a headphone in that price range. Finally, I brought out the HiFiMan Arya Stealth Magnet Edition again to do a comp here, because the price on this one was dropped to $999 USD. It was $1,600 when it was first launched, and then it was $1,300 for a while and all that. And the reason that I brought this one out is I wanted to know, like, does this one reach up to like that next performance tier in price with its performance? And almost, but not quite. The Arya had similar width, but a little bit better depth to the staging, and it had more height. And I know some people scoff at the idea of height, but I do think it is a real thing. Particularly if you listen to something like the, what's the name of it? Drawing a blank. Duel of the Fates by John Williams. There it is, from the Phantom Menace soundtrack. Orchestra out in front of you on ground level, and then behind the orchestra on risers, so a change in height, is a choir. And the Arya does a little bit better job of placing that choir behind the orchestra, and then also telling you that, you know what, like, there are risers, there are levels of singers going up on those risers that doesn't come out quite as clearly on the Bore here. I think the Arya is also still just a little bit more resolving. I got a little bit better sense of texturing, a little bit more definition on things like room reverbs. Ghost notes came out a little bit more clearly. There's a little bit better audience noise for live recordings, all that, or a little bit more realistic and believable, I should say, here. And yeah, I think it's timbre overall. It doesn't have that mid-range wonkiness at 1.5 kilohertz. So vocals sound a little bit more natural to me, and they also sound like they are a little bit more organically part of the whole presentation, whereas they stand out just a little bit here because of that 1.5 kilohertz forwardness. Okay. But I think that the Bore still has the dynamics advantage. Like in the low end, even though it doesn't extend quite as much, it hits a little bit harder yet and all that. But those differences that I just described in terms of the other technicalities, like the resolution and the staging accuracy and all of that, are very close. The Borealis is hot on the heels of the Arya in all of those things. So it does a pretty good job of reaching up almost catching like that next performance tier up there. So let's wrap this up. I've had a lot of good things to say about the Borealis, and I think deservedly so. It is a good headphone that I enjoyed listening to. It is one of the better headphones that I have heard under $1,000 right now. May have been in running for the best, or at least a strong contender for best under $1,000, if it weren't for the fact that HiFiMan has completely flexed on the whole headphone market by slashing their prices and putting the Arya SE down under $1,000 right now. But outside of that, really strong effort here. That is only hampered a little bit for me by how loose the clamp is. I do wish that it clamped just a little bit harder, and so it stayed in place on my head just a little bit more. And then the 1.5 kilohertz forwardness does make vocal timbre and some instrument timbres just a little bit wonky, just a little bit hollow, not quite as tonally balanced as I would like to hear them through any headphone, okay? You know, especially when we're getting up close to $1,000, I think we need to smooth that out just a little bit as a general rule. But that forwardness is not a deal breaker even for me, who is sensitive to things like shoutiness and honkiness. It is there, it is noticeable, it is distracting sometimes, but it is not a huge problem in the grand scheme. I don't think it would be something that if I were to buy one of these that I would hear that and return the headphone for. It's probably something that I could just get used to, like it is in that range. All right, so I am Wave Theory. This has been the Aurorus Borealis. Pretty easy to recommend if you're shopping for an open back headphone in that $800 to $1,000 range. Definitely check this one out. It's got a lot of things going for it and relatively few drawbacks. So thanks to Aurorus for sending this over for review. Thanks for thinking of me. I enjoyed listening to your headphone. And I will get the review of your Australis up pretty soon here, hopefully within the next week or two after this one drops. But for now, I am Wave Theory. Thanks for watching this review. Please remember to leave a like if you haven't, leave a comment down below if you haven't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Check out my PayPal and my Patreon and look for ways that you can support this channel going forward so I can continue to bring you good content like this because I don't really get paid to do this other than through views and Patreon and those kinds of things. So, as always, enjoy the music.